As you watch this right now, Crimea, regarded for years as Putin's impregnable fortress, is experiencing a structural collapse that even seasoned analysts hadn't predicted would happen this fast. $620 million. That's the estimated cumulative damage Ukrainian forces have inflicted on Russian command networks, logistics, and defense systems across the peninsula in recent weeks. But these numbers tell only part of the story. Today I'm taking you inside the hour-by-hour timeline of how one of the most fortified regions of the Russian military transformed into a territory where every movement became a lethal risk, where soldiers abandoned positions without waiting for orders, and where the chain of command is disintegrating under the constant pressure of Ukrainian precision warfare. Welcome to Global Briefing. I'm Sarah, and this is the analysis the Kremlin doesn't want you to see.
"6:10 in the morning. Ukrainian reconnaissance drones positioned across multiple sectors in northern and central Crimea detect something unexpected: Russian troop movements. But these aren't reinforcements arriving, these are withdrawals. Units that had remained stationary for weeks were suddenly pulling back, abandoning partially constructed fortifications and empty observation posts. No direct assault was underway, no massive Ukrainian offensive was pressing on the lines. So why were they fleeing? The answer lies in months of systematic Ukrainian pressure, not frontal attacks against fortified bunkers, but a surgical precision campaign against everything that allows an army to exist: ammunition depots, fuel warehouses, radar sites, transport convoys. Ukraine wasn't trying to destroy the Russian army in Crimea through direct combat, it was destroying its ability to fight. And at 6:10 in the morning, that approach began bearing fruit in visible ways. Shortly after, Ukrainian reconnaissance teams monitoring intercepted Russian radio communications reported something even more troubling for Moscow: widespread failures across battalion networks, static, dropped connections, command posts not responding. This wasn't a random technical problem, it was the result of a Ukrainian campaign targeting mobile relay stations, command shelters, and communication hubs. Without reliable channels, Russian units couldn't coordinate defensive actions. Some commanders issued conflicting orders, others issued no orders at all. Frontline soldiers became increasingly uncertain. Were reinforcements coming, or had they been silently abandoned? This communication collapse produced a psychological effect almost as damaging as the physical strikes. Troops began acting more cautiously, more independently, and with less confidence in centralized direction. 7:20 a.m. The consequences of Ukraine's long-range precision tactics became impossible for Russian forces to ignore. Supply convoys attempting to move ammunition and fuel into frontline sectors were repeatedly intercepted by Ukrainian drone surveillance, followed by artillery strikes. What once took hours now required days, and in some sectors, resupply hadn't occurred for nearly a week. Imagine being a Russian soldier in a fortified trench. You have ammunition for maybe 2 days of intense combat. Food is rationed, fuel for the generators is almost gone, and the last promised convoy destroyed by a drone nobody saw coming. Soldiers began rationing ammunition to the point where meaningful defense became unviable. Fuel shortages forced units to abandon armored vehicles, some of which had been partially hidden to avoid detection, but lacked the diesel necessary to relocate. Analysts estimate these disruptions and losses, destroyed trucks, damaged depots, eliminated stockpiles, abandoned equipment, accounted for roughly $180 million of the cumulative damage inflicted on Russian operational capacity. 180 million, and this is just the first wave of losses. 8 a.m. The broader infrastructure connecting Crimea's defensive sectors began to collapse. Ukraine's repeated strikes on bridges, rail junctions, and road hubs had effectively split the peninsula into isolated pockets of Russian control. Reinforcement routes became unreliable. Medical evacuation corridors became dangerous. Every movement, whether troops, supplies, or vehicles, risked exposure to Ukrainian drones monitoring open terrain and choke points with near-constant surveillance. This landscape of fragmented mobility removed Russia's ability to regroup forces into coherent defensive lines. Officers reported increasing numbers of soldiers refusing frontline assignments, aware that logistical support couldn't reach them in time if an engagement escalated. 9:15 a.m. Ukrainian drone operators intensified reconnaissance over Russian fortifications. Using long-endurance systems capable of maintaining observation for hours, they documented collapsing trench networks, abandoned fighting positions, and destroyed command shelters. But these drones weren't just observing, they were guiding precision strikes. High-value targets, air defense radars, mobile missile batteries, many of which had been relocated hastily and were operating with incomplete setup, were hit with lethal precision. Russian troops described the drones' constant presence as suffocating. No movement felt safe, no command post felt hidden, no convoy could travel unobserved. This pervasive surveillance produced a sense of exposure and vulnerability that eroded discipline and morale. As the ground situation worsened, the Black Sea Fleet added another layer of instability. Ukrainian attacks on naval piers, repair docks, and coastal logistics hubs forced Russia to relocate ships and submarines farther east, removing them from positions they once used to support Crimea's defenses. With naval protection weakened, coastal missile coverage thinned, and maritime supply routes degraded, land-based forces experienced increased strain on an already collapsing logistics system. Analysts noted the fleet's withdrawal carried not only operational consequences, but symbolic ones. A force once projected as dominant in the Black Sea was now repositioning to avoid destruction. The myth of Russian invincibility in the region was crumbling not just on land, but at sea. 11:40 a.m. Signs of civilian anxiety appeared across the peninsula. Long lines formed at fuel stations, checkpoints overflowed with vehicles. Rumors spread rapidly across social platforms inside Crimea. Many residents who had believed Russia's assurances of stability now witnessed troops abandoning positions, relocating equipment, or retreating southward. These population movements further complicated Russian military actions. Overcrowded roads slowed troop transfers. Panicked civilians competed for the same routes used by military convoys. Commanders struggled to maintain order amid overlapping confusion across both military and civilian networks. 12:30 p.m. Ukraine's intelligence capabilities demonstrated striking effectiveness. Several Russian command centers were hit within minutes of senior officers arriving. This pattern indicated real-time targeting, informed by drones, satellite imagery, electronic intelligence, and, possibly, internal sources within Crimea. With leadership nodes frequently destroyed or disrupted, Russian battalions found themselves without coherent direction. Some units adopted defensive postures on their own, others attempted localized retreats. The chain of command, crucial in any coordinated defense, showed clear signs of fragmentation. Troops no longer looked upward for guidance, they looked sideways for survival. 1:45 p.m. The cumulative effect of Ukraine's long-term operational strategy had matured into a decisive turning point. Rather than launching direct assaults on heavy fortifications, Ukraine had concentrated on degrading essential systems that allowed Russia to sustain these positions at all. Logistics, communications, morale, leadership, air defense structures, mobility corridors, all gradually dismantled. As these components eroded, Russian troops increasingly recognized that holding fixed positions meant exposing themselves to destruction without the ability to respond. Some units began retreating without awaiting permission. Others abandoned armored transports or electronic warfare vehicles when fuel or spare parts were no longer available. These abandoned systems represented not only material losses, but also signaled a deeper collapse of command cohesion. In the following stages, Ukrainian forces began advancing into areas weakened by logistical disintegration. Their movements were careful and methodical, designed to test Russian responsiveness rather than rush toward deeper lines. In many sectors, Ukrainian troops encountered little resistance. Empty trenches, discarded uniforms, and hastily left supply crates reflected the growing inability of Russian troops to hold terrain. The psychological momentum shifted visibly. Ukrainian forces operated with increasing confidence. Russian defenders showed hesitation and uncertainty. Analysts noted that battlefield momentum, shaped by confidence, fear, and fatigue, often precedes physical collapse, and in Crimea, that psychological moment was arriving. 3:30 p.m. several Russian battalions initiated broad fallback movements toward secondary defensive belts. However, these routes were monitored by Ukrainian drones guiding artillery, making retreat dangerous and slow. Columns attempting to regroup came under repeated fire. Unable to withdraw in organized formations, some units abandoned vehicles and moved on foot through civilian areas. Others took shelter in buildings or wooded zones to avoid detection. This behavior highlighted a collapse in discipline, with soldiers prioritizing evasion over coordinated defense. Commanders struggled to regain control of troops who had lost confidence in their ability to survive in exposed positions. 4:50 p.m. Russian commanders faced a strategic dilemma with no favorable solution. Holding collapsing positions risked encirclement and greater losses. Retreating risked triggering wider panic among remaining troops. Reinforcing the peninsula had become nearly impossible. Ukraine's expanding long-range strike capability, combined with its ability to suppress air defenses, rendered airlift operations too dangerous. Naval transport faced similar risks. Overland convoys were frequently identified and targeted. Crimea, once described as Russia's most secure military zone, now functioned more like a containment space where every movement carried significant operational risk. As the day progressed, Ukrainian intelligence confirmed that Russian defensive networks could no longer operate in a coordinated manner. Units were acting independently, reacting to threats as isolated groups rather than as components of a unified force. The degradation of Russian infrastructure, destroyed depots, damaged radars, abandoned vehicles, collapsed defensive positions, accounted for an estimated $440 million in additional losses, bringing the total cumulative impact across the peninsula to approximately $620 million. This figure reflected not only equipment losses, but also the destruction of the systems required to sustain an effective military presence. As night approached, Ukrainian troops continued controlled advances, supported by drone fleets monitoring Russian withdrawals. The psychological difference between the two armies grew increasingly pronounced. Ukrainian soldiers saw an achievable objective ahead, the possibility of reclaiming Crimea after years of preparation. Russian troops, by contrast, encountered growing uncertainty, shrinking support structures, and declining morale. With each passing hour, their confidence eroded further. This imbalance began shaping the tactical reality across the peninsula. One side advanced with purpose, the other fought primarily for escape. Today, Crimea stands at the center of a profound strategic reversal. Russian forces have lost access to reliable supply routes, abandoned fortified positions, and suffered nearly $620 million in cumulative losses across logistics, infrastructure, defensive systems, and equipment. Their lines are fractured, morale is sinking, command networks are struggling to function under constant pressure. Ukraine, through deliberate planning and precise execution, has transformed Crimea from a symbol of Russian strength into a landscape defined by vulnerability. The critical question now is this: will this collapse continue accelerating, or can Russian forces stabilize their positions before Ukraine pushes into the next decisive phase of operations? Because if the patterns of recent days are any indication, Crimea, the peninsula Putin annexed in 2014 as a demonstration of power, could become his greatest strategic failure. And this time, it won't be the Kremlin propaganda writing the history, it will be the facts on the ground. If this analysis opened your eyes to the real situation in Crimea, leave a like and subscribe to Global Briefing for analysis that goes beyond the headlines. The Russia crisis is evolving every day, the Ukraine war is entering a critical phase, and Kremlin propaganda is working overtime to hide these truths. We'll continue bringing you the facts. See you in the next video.